On my wedding night, my husband told me he was too tired, rolled over, and went to sleep. A few hours later, I woke up to the sound of him moaning in his mother's hotel room next door. That single moment is the real beginning of my story. Before that, my life was something out of a magazine. I was Isabella, a successful architect with a brand new luxurious apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. I had just married Ethan, a man so charming and devoted, our friends called us the golden couple. He was my fairy tale, and our wedding was the grand finale, a massive, elegant affair that screamed happily ever after. His mother, Margaret, was always there, a bit too close, a bit too needy. But I dismissed it as the fierce love of a widow for her only son. I was a fool. The fairy tale shattered in our 5-star honeymoon suite. Rose petals were everywhere. The champagne was on ice, and all I could feel was a deep, gut-wrenching confusion. When I had reached for him, my heart full of love and hope for our future, he had gently pushed my hand away. He just told me, "I'm tired, Izzy. It was a long day. Can we just sleep?" I'd rationalized it, of course. He was right. The day had been a marathon, so I hid my disappointment, turned off the light, and pretended to sleep. But when I woke up thirsty in the dead of night, the space beside me was cold and empty. That's when I heard it through the wall. First, his low, unmistakable whisper. Then, her soft laugh. And finally, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. A long, breathy moan. It was a sound of intimacy, of secrecy. It was the sound of my world falling apart. This is the story of how I learned my entire marriage was a lie. A calculated plot designed by my husband and his mother to destroy me. It's a twisted, painful story, and I'll need a friend to see it through. To be sure you hear how it all ends, you can follow the stories told here. That way, you won't miss the next part. The next morning, I woke up to bright sunlight streaming through the window and the hollow, sick feeling of dread in my gut. The sounds from the night before played on a loop in my head. The whisper, the laugh, the moan. I kept telling myself it was a weird, stress-induced hallucination after the exhaustion of the wedding. I desperately wanted to believe that. When I finally dragged myself out of bed, I found Ethan and his mother, Margaret, already at a table on the hotel's terrace, sipping cappuccinos and laughing. They looked so bright and refreshed, like two people who had just had the best sleep of their lives. Seeing them together, so normal, so cheerful, made my skin crawl. Ethan's face lit up when he saw me. He stood up, pulled out my chair, and gave me a kiss on the cheek that felt performative, like we were on stage. Margaret just smiled at me over the rim of her coffee cup, a serene, knowing little smile that made me feel like an outsider. I had to say something. I had to know. I stirred my orange juice, trying to make my voice sound light, casual. I told him, "You were out of bed for a while last night. I heard some strange noises, too. Did you hear anything?" Ethan chuckled, a dismissive little sound. He reached across the table and patted my hand, his touch feeling more like a parent calming a hysterical child than a husband comforting his wife. He told me I must have been dreaming, that the wedding had completely worn me out. He said he'd slept like a rock and hadn't moved an inch all night. He looked me right in the eye, his gaze so steady, so convincing, that for a split second I almost believed him. But then I glanced at Margaret. Her smile hadn't wavered. It was still there, placid and unreadable. And in that moment, I knew it was the first time he used the truth as a weapon against my own mind, and I felt a profound sense of loneliness wash over me. Flew back to Chicago, back to our beautiful life. On the surface, everything was perfect. We hosted dinner parties, we went to gallery openings, we were the image of newlywed bliss. Margaret, who was only supposed to stay for a couple of weeks to help us get settled, showed no signs of leaving. Her suitcases remained in the guest room, but her things began to spread through the apartment like an invasive vine. Her expensive face creams colonized my bathroom counter. Her opinions dictated our dinner menu. The home I had designed, my sanctuary, was slowly starting to feel like her territory. I tried to ignore the growing unease. I was busy with a new project at work, a skyscraper that was consuming all my creative energy. I wanted to believe that the weirdness was all in my head, a symptom of adjusting to married life. But the cracks were starting to show, faint at first, then impossible to ignore. There were the phone calls. Every morning, the first thing he did when he woke up was call her. Every night, it was the last thing he did before bed. They would talk in low, hushed tones, their voices dropping if I walked into the room. If I asked what it was about, he'd just say he was checking on her, making sure she wasn't lonely. Then it was the decisions. Big ones. We were supposed to be choosing a new investment portfolio for our joint savings. I'd done my research, prepared a strategy, but when I presented it to Ethan, he just gave me a vague smile and said he needed to run it by Margaret first, because she had a real knack for these things. A knack? She was a retired socialite who had inherited her money. I was the one with the business degree, but my opinion suddenly was secondary. The real break, the moment that my vague suspicion hardened into cold, sharp certainty, happened on a rainy Tuesday afternoon about 2 months after the wedding. I was sorting through a stack of mail, and I opened the statement for our joint credit card. My eyes scanned the list of transactions, a boring collection of our shared life. Groceries, dinners, gas, dry cleaning. And then I saw it. A charge for $850 from a boutique jewelry store on Oak Street, one of the most exclusive in the city. I frowned. My birthday had been the month before, but he'd given me a weekend trip to a spa. Our anniversary was almost a year away. My heart started to beat a little faster. I flipped through the previous month's statement, which I had filed away without a second glance. There it was again. A different charge, this time for $1,200 from the same store. A cold feeling washed over me as I did the math. He was spending thousands of dollars on jewelry. Exquisite, expensive jewelry that I had never seen. An affair. The thought was ugly and painful, but in a strange way it was almost a relief. An affair was something I could understand. It was a common, sordid, human betrayal. I stood there in the quiet of our apartment, the gray afternoon light filtering through the window. The only sound the soft ticking of the clock on the wall. That sound seemed to be counting down the seconds of my old life. Innocent, trusting woman I used to be was gone. This was someone else. Someone more watch. In my hands, I held and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that this was just the beginning. The jewelry wasn't the whole. It was just the first clue, pulling me deeper into a mystery I was now terrified and determined to solve. For 2 days, I said nothing. I walked around our apartment holding the knowledge of the jewelry store like a shard of glass in my hand. At night, I'd lie beside Ethan in the dark, feeling the warmth from his body. And I'd wonder who she was. Was she younger? Was she a coworker? The questions were a constant, tormenting drumbeat in my mind. The pain of a simple affair was something I thought I could process. It was the not knowing that was eating me alive. I knew I couldn't confront him. Not yet. He was too good at lying, at turning reality on its head until I was the one apologizing. I needed proof, something real and solid that he couldn't possibly deny. My chance came on a Saturday morning. Ethan was in one of his cheerful domestic moods, the kind that used to make me feel so safe. He announced he was going to the gym for a serious workout and would be gone for at least a couple of hours. As I watched him leave, kissing me goodbye at the door, I had to force myself to smile. The moment the lock clicked shut, the performance was over. My face went rigid. The apartment, once my sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene, and I was the sole detective. My heart was hammering against my ribs. A frantic, trapped bird. Where do you look for a secret you don't want to find? I started in his office. I went through his desk drawers, my fingers skimming over boring stacks of paper, pens, and paper clips. Nothing. I checked his briefcase, my hands fumbling with the clasp. Just his laptop and some files from work. A part of me felt a flicker of hope. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe the jewelry was an investment or a gift for a client's wife. But my gut, that cold, heavy knot in my stomach, told me to keep looking. I went to our bedroom. The air was still and quiet. His scent, a mix of his cologne and soap, lingered on the pillows. It felt like a violation, searching through the personal space of the man I loved, but love had nothing to do with this anymore. This was about survival. I opened his side of the closet, pushing aside the perfectly ironed shirts and expensive suits. I ran my hands through the pockets of every jacket, every pair of pants. I found receipts, loose change, a ticket stub from a movie we saw together. My desperation grew with every empty pocket. I was running out of time. Then I saw his dresser. The bottom drawer was where he kept his socks and workout clothes, a jumbled mess I usually avoided. I pulled it open, the wood scraping softly in the silent. I dug my hands in, pushing aside balled-up socks and old t-shirts. My fingers brushed against something in the far back corner. something small, firm, and covered in a soft fabric. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled it out. It was a small, dark blue velvet box. It felt heavy in my trembling hand, heavy with the truth I was about to uncover. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my heart pounding so hard I could hear the blood rushing in my ears. I slowly, deliberately lifted the lid. There, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a diamond necklace. It was exquisite, a delicate platinum chain with a single brilliant-cut diamond that caught the light and shattered it into 100 tiny rainbows. It was a declaration of love, a serious, expensive promise. And it wasn't for me. A wave of nausea washed over. This was it, the irrefutable proof. I was about to snap the box shut and put it back. The image of the necklace burned into my memory when a sudden, chilling detail made me freeze. I opened it again, my eyes narrowing. There was something familiar about the design, the way the diamond was set. I'd seen it before. My mind raced, flipping through recent memories like a frantic slideshow. Dinner parties, holiday brunches, casual visits. Where had I seen it? And then it hit me with the force of a physical blow. Margaret, his mother. She wore that exact necklace, not a similar one. That one. I had complimented it just a few weeks ago at a restaurant. I remembered her touching it, smiling that smug little smile of hers, and telling me it was an old family heirloom. The puzzle pieces in my head didn't just fall into place. They shattered and reformed into a picture so grotesque I couldn't comprehend. Why was he hiding a necklace in his sock drawer that his mother already wore every day? Was this a spare? Did he buy the matching necklaces, like twisted friendship bracelets? Or was the one she wore a fake? And this was the real one. The possible explanation was more bizarre, more disturbing than the last. The simple narrative of an affair evaporated, replaced by something dark and incomprehensible. I heard his keys jangling at the front door. Panic. I snapped the box shut, shoved it back into the depths of the drawer under the socks, and closed it. Just as he walked into the bedroom, flushed and sweaty from his workout. He smiled at me, a wide, innocent smile, and asked what I wanted to do for lunch. I looked at the man I had promised my life to, the man I thought I knew better than myself. In that instant, the floor of my world gave way. This wasn't a man who was cheating on me. This was something else entirely. As I stood there, forcing a smile back, I understood that I wasn't just married to a liar, I was married to a monster. And his accomplice was his mother. Living with the secret of the velvet box was like living with a ghost. The ghost of my marriage followed me through every room of our apartment. Every time I saw Ethan and Margaret sitting together on the couch, their heads bent in a quiet conversation that stopped the moment I entered. It's a chill. Every shared glance between them at the dinner table, every inside joke I wasn't privy to, felt like a secret language designed to exclude me. The whole dynamic, which I had once seen as a slightly overbearing but ultimately harmless mother-son bond, now seemed sinister, twisted. My home, the space I had meticulously designed to be a haven of peace and beauty, now felt like an elaborate stage, and I was the only actor who didn't know her lines. The necklace was a piece of the puzzle, but it was a piece that didn't fit anywhere. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to formulate a theory that made sense. But nothing did. The situation was too bizarre, too far outside the realm of normal human behavior. My architect's mind, trained to find logic and structure, was failing me. I knew they were hiding something monumental, but I couldn't see the shape of it. I felt like I was going crazy, adrift in a sea of paranoia with no land in sight. I needed more than feelings and strange clues. I needed data. I needed facts. I needed a map of his lies. That's when I decided to do something I never in a million years thought I'd be capable of. It felt like a betrayal in itself, a violation of the trust I was so desperate to believe still existed on some level. The Isabella who believed in blind trust was gone. In her place was a woman fighting for her own sanity. One evening, while Ethan was on a long, rambling phone call with Margaret in the other room, I took his phone. Hands were shaking so violently I could barely type. With my heart pounding in my ears, I downloaded a tracking application and hid it deep within a folder of boring utility apps I knew he'd never open. It was done in less than a minute. Handing his phone back to him when he returned to the room, smiling as if I'd just been checking the weather, was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do. For the first week, the little blue dot on my screen did nothing but confirm his normal routine. It traced his path from our apartment to his office, from his office to the gym, from the gym back home. I felt a sliver of hope and a larger wave of guilt. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was the one destroying our marriage with my suspicion. The thought made me sick. I was so ready to believe I was crazy, so willing to accept any explanation that would give me my life back. Then came Friday. Ethan came home from work and told me he had a career-defining dinner that night. He said it was with a group of potential investors from Zurich, and if he landed their account, it would all but guarantee his promotion. He needed to be at his best, focused and charming. He told me not to wait up, that he would be very late. He kissed me, a long, convincing kiss, and I watched him walk out the door, the perfect picture of an ambitious husband. I spent the evening trying to work, but the blueprints on my screen were just a blur. Every nerve in my body was screaming. Around 8 o'clock, I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the app. I expected to see his dot in the heart of downtown at one of the expensive steakhouses he'd mentioned. But it wasn't there. It was on the highway, heading west, moving steadily away from the glittering city skyline. I watched, mesmerized and horrified, as the dot traveled further and further into the suburbs. It didn't stop until it reached Naperville, one of the wealthiest and most remote suburbs of Chicago. It finally came to rest on a quiet, tree-lined street, settling over a single, sprawling residential property. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Last-minute change of venue. Was one of the investors sick? But he would have called. He would have told me. Trembling fingers, I copied the address into a search engine. Public property records were the first result. I clicked the link, my blood turning to ice water in my veins. I typed in the address. The page loaded, and there it was. In cold, black and white digital owner, Margaret Sterling. I dropped my phone on the floor. It wasn't a second apartment. It was a house. A whole secret house. He hadn't gone to a business dinner. He had lied, with a kiss and a perfectly rehearsed story, so he could go home to his mother. The recurring jewelry payments, the constant phone calls, her refusal to leave our apartment. It wasn't a series of strange coincidences. It was a conspiracy. They were living a double life, a life they had built together behind my back, and for how long, I could only guess. The depth of the deception was breathtaking. I sank to the hardwood floor, pulling my knees to my chest. The tears finally came, silent and hot. I cried for the woman I was on my wedding day, so full of hope and love. I cried for the life I thought I was building. I grieved the death of the man I thought I had married. I let myself feel it all. The crushing weight of being so completely and utterly. But as the hours, that little blue dot on my phone screen remained defiantly fixed in that house, my sorrow began to something solid and the sadness turned to ice, and the ice turned to rage, calm, calculated rage. I stood up, my body steady, my vision, the tears were gone. The floor of the beautiful apartment he had helped me choose. I finally let the man I loved die, and in his place, I swore I would build my revenge. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The rage from the night before hadn't faded. It had cooled into a tool, something sharp and precise. I left Ethan sleeping in our bed. Our bed, the thought was a bitter joke, and went to my office. I closed the door, my movements silent and deliberate. I wasn't a wife anymore. I was a strategist. My first move was to find a professional, someone who operated in the world of secrets and lies, just as Ethan and Margaret did. I spent an hour researching, my fingers flying across the keyboard, before I found the right firm. I made the call, my voice a low, steady whisper. I explained that I needed a private investigator for a delicate marital issue. I gave them a name, an address, and a license plate number. I was calm, efficient, and detached. The woman on the other end of the line was professional and discreet. Before Ethan had even stirred, the surveillance had begun. Hiring the PI was the easy part. The waiting, the pretending. That was the true test. I had to become the greatest actor of my life. I had to live inside the lie, to breathe its toxic air and not let it show. When Ethan finally woke up, I was in the kitchen making coffee just like any other Saturday morning. I smiled at him. I asked him how the big investor dinner went. The performance he gave was masterful. He lit up, his eyes wide with feigned excitement. He told me it had been a massive success, that the investors were practically eating out of his hand. He described the food, the wine, the complex financial strategies he had supposedly discussed. He was so detailed, so enthusiastic, that the old me would have been bursting with pride. The new me just stood there, sipping my coffee, the ceramic warm against my hands, and I felt nothing but a profound, chilling emptiness. I told him I was so proud of him, and the ease with which the lie slid from my tongue terrified me, becoming one of them. From that day on, I was a spy in my own. I watched them constantly, not with the wounded eyes of a betrayed wife, but with the cold, calculating gaze of I studied their routines, their habits, the subtle, non-verbal ways they communicated. A slight raise of an eyebrow from Margaret over the dinner table could silence Ethan mid-sentence. A quick touch of his hand on her arm as they passed in the hallway seemed to convey a whole conversation. They were a unit, a two-person conspiracy, and I was the mark. To keep them unsuspecting, I had to be the perfect, doting, slightly naive wife. Had to be the Isabella they thought they knew, the one they believed was too in love to ever see the truth. I suggested we host a brunch the following weekend, a celebration of his recent success. I invited a few of our friends to make it look legitimate. It was the perfect opportunity to observe them in a social setting. I played my part beautifully. I was effervescent, refilling glasses, laughing at jokes, clinging to Ethan's arm. At one point, I deliberately brought the conversation around to Margaret's necklace. I complimented it again, telling our friends the story she had told me, about how it was a precious family heirloom. I watched her as she smiled and accepted the praise, her hand going to the diamond at her throat. There wasn't a flicker of discomfort, not a hint of deception. She was a true sociopath. The moment, the slip, the crack in their perfect facade came later, after the guests had left. It was just the three of us, cleaning up in the kitchen, feeling bold. I started talking I mentioned in an off how wonderful it would be to buy a big house a place with a garden and lots of land. Ethan, buoyed by the success of the party and full of arrogant confidence, agreed enthusiastically. He said it was a brilliant idea, that they should start looking for properties soon, and then he made his mistake. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but to my hyper-aware senses, it was a thunderclap. He said that the place in Naperville had given him some great ideas for what he'd want in a backyard. Silence. A split second of dead air. I saw it in his eyes. The immediate sheer panic of a liar who has just exposed himself. I saw Margaret, who was standing by the sink, go absolutely still. Her back was to me, but I saw her shoulders tense, her posture becoming ramrod straight. Ethan scrambled to recover. He let out a forced, awkward laugh. He claimed he meant a client's house in Naperville he had visited last month. He said it had a magnificent garden, and it had just stuck in his mind. He was talking too fast, his explanation clumsy and transparent. He glanced at Margaret, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes. I saw her turn her head just enough to shoot him a look of such utter contempt for his carelessness that it made me flinch. I knew in that moment I had them. I saved him. I laughed, a light, airy sound. I told him he was always so inspired by his work, and that it was one of the things I loved about him. I changed the subject immediately, asking what we should do with the leftover. I made him feel safe. I made him believe he had gotten away with it. He visibly relaxed, shooting a grateful look at me and a sheepish one at his mother. They had no idea what had just happened. They thought it was a near miss. But his slip wasn't just about a house. It was a confession. It confirmed that the secret house wasn't just a place they visited. It was a blueprint for their future. A future they were planning together, funded by my money. And Margaret's silent, venomous glare revealed the first real crack in their alliance. He was reckless. She was ruthless. Their arrogance was their greatest weakness. He thought he had just covered a simple mistake. He had no idea he had just handed me the weapon I would use to destroy them both. A week after the disastrous brunch, I received an email. It had no subject line, and the sender was an anonymous, encrypted address. Inside, there was only a single password-protected file. My hands were surprisingly steady as I typed in the password the investigator had given me over the phone. I clicked enter, and my life split into two distinct parts: the time before I saw the truth, and the time after. The file opened into a gallery of photographs. The first few were mundane. Ethan leaving our apartment building, Margaret getting into her car. But as I scrolled down, the images became sharper, more intimate. There they were, walking out of a grocery store in Naperville. Ethan pushing the cart, Margaret's hand resting comfortably in the crook of his arm. Another photo showed them at an outdoor cafe, sitting side by side on a bench, laughing. His arm was draped casually around her shoulders. They looked for all the world like a happy, relaxed couple enjoying a sunny afternoon. They looked like my husband and me. Then, I came to the last photo. It was taken at dusk, with the warm glow of a porch light illuminating the front of the Naperville house. Ethan was leaning down, his hand cupping Margaret's jaw, and he was kissing her. It wasn't a quick, familial peck. It was a deep, lingering kiss, the kind shared between lovers. Her eyes were closed, her body angled towards his. The sight of it didn't make me far beyond tears. A wave of pure, unadulterated revulsion washed over me, so strong it made me physically recoil from my screen. It was a violation of the natural order of things, a perversion so profound I had no words for it. I thought that photo would be the worst of it. I thought the visual proof of their relationship was the final, ugly secret. I was wrong. That was just the how. The truly devastating part, the part that laid bare the cold, black heart of their betrayal, was in the second half of the report. The man I had married, the successful financial consultant Ethan Sterling, was a complete fabrication. The investigator had dug deep, pulling records I never would have had access to. Far from being a rising star, Ethan was a mess of bad investments and hidden vices. The report detailed over $200,000 in debt, not to respectable banks, but to shady online gambling sites and high-interest private lenders. He had been chasing his losses for years, digging himself into a hole so deep he would never have been able to climb out. He wasn't just bad with money, he was on the verge of total collapse. He was a house of cards, one stiff breeze away from ruin, and Margaret was the architect of the whole scheme. The PI's report on her was just as shocking. The wealthy widow, the sophisticated socialite, was a myth. A series of disastrous investments had wiped out the majority of her late husband's fortune years ago. She had been living a lie, selling off assets in secret while maintaining the public facade of old money elegance. Her entire identity, her social standing, was built on a foundation of rapidly dwindling cash. She was just as desperate as he was. Reading the cold, hard fact, I felt the final pieces of the puzzle click into place with horrifying clarity. This was never about a forbidden, twisted love. That was just a symptom of the disease. The real motivation, the engine driving this entire conspiracy, was pure, calculated. Margaret, facing the humiliating prospect of losing her status, had seen me as the perfect solution. I wasn't just a woman her son could marry, I was a business opportunity, a walking, talking bailout package. I had a successful career, a spotless reputation, and, as she had undoubtedly researched, a considerable family trust fund I was due to inherit. The plan was as cruel as it was brilliant. She would use her desperate son as bait. He would charm me, marry me, and secure access to my finances. Then, together, they would systematically drain my accounts to pay off his gambling debts and replenish her depleted fortune. The Naperville house, I now realized, was likely the first major purchase they made with my money, the cornerstone of the new, luxurious life they were building for themselves on the ashes of mine. The kiss, the shared glances, the secret life. It was all secondary. The primary crime was financial. I wasn't a person to them. I was an asset to be liquidated. They had vetted me, targeted me, and executed a hostile takeover of my life, my heart, and my bank account. The revulsion I felt from the photos was suddenly eclipsed by a new emotion: cold, corporate fury. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a business deal, and they had mistaken my love for stupidity, trust for weakness. I closed the file, the glow of the screen disappearing to plunge the room into near darkness. I finally understood. I wasn't the heartbroken victim of a bizarre family drama. I was the target of a meticulously planned financial heist. And the perpetrators had made one fatal miscalculation. They had tried to swindle an architect, a woman who understands that the most beautiful facades can hide the weakest foundations. They thought they were building an empire with my resources. They had no idea I was about to build them a prison. For 48 hours after I read the investigator's report, I didn't sleep. I existed on black coffee and the cold, burning fuel of my rage. I sat in my home office, the damning file open on my laptop, and I started to build a case. I cross-referenced the PI's findings with our joint bank accounts, highlighting every suspicious transfer, every unexplained withdrawal. The numbers painted a story of meticulous, systematic theft that had been going on since the first week of our marriage. The scale of it was staggering. I had the evidence, the timeline, the motive. But I was an architect. I designed buildings, not legal strategy. I knew how to build a case on paper, but I had no idea how to turn it into a weapon. The weight of the information, of the fight that lay ahead, was crushing. I realized in the dead of night that I couldn't do this alone. There was only one person in the world I could trust, friend, Sarah. We'd been inseparable since we were roommates in college, but our friendship was more than just history. It was a balance of powers. I was the creative, the designer. Sarah was the strategist, the warrior. She had gone to law school and risen through the ranks to become one of the most feared corporate litigators in Chicago. She was brilliant, ruthless, and the only person I knew who could look at the absolute devastation of my life and see a clear path to victory. I called her and asked if I could meet her at her office. I kept my voice even, but she knew me too well. She heard the tremor I was trying to hide and told me to be there at 7. Her office was on the 50th floor of a downtown skyscraper, a glass and steel tower that looked out over the entire city. It was a place of power, which was exactly what I needed. When I arrived, the firm was quiet, the army of lawyers having gone home for the day. Sarah met me in the lobby and led me to a large, empty conference room. The long, polished mahogany table reflected the glittering city lights, making it feel like we were floating in the sky. I didn't cry. I didn't rage. I simply opened my laptop, turned it to face her, and told her everything. I started with the sounds through the hotel wall on my wedding night and ended with the investigator's report. I walked her through the financial statements, pointing out the transfers that matched the dates of Ethan's secret trips to Naperville. Then, I showed her the photos. I watched her face as she scrolled through them. Her expression, usually so animated, became a stony mask of disbelief. When she got to the final picture, the one of the kiss on the porch, she just stared at it for a full minute. Only sound in the room was the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. When she finally looked up, her eyes were blazing. The shock had been replaced by a controlled fury that was even more intense than my own. She didn't offer me platitudes or a comforting hug. She saw the situation for what it was. Not just a personal betrayal, but a declaration of war. She looked at me across that vast, polished table, and her first words were not about my broken heart, but about the crime. She told me this was grand larceny, conspiracy to commit fraud, a textbook case of financial abuse that would put them both in prison for years. In that moment, I felt the crushing weight on my chest lighten for the first time in months. I wasn't alone anymore. I had an ally. More than that, I had a general. Sarah immediately shifted into action. She stood up and started pacing in front of the window, a predator mapping out her attack. She explained that our first move, our absolute top priority, had to be to cut off their supply line. They were still actively stealing from me, and we had to stop the bleeding without alerting them. For the next 3 hours, Sarah was a whirlwind of focused energy. She brought in a forensic accountant she kept on retainer, a quiet, serious man who came to the office in the middle of the night. Together, the 3 of us worked. Sarah dictated legal documents while I provided account numbers and financial histories. The plan she devised was audacious. We created a new holding company, a legally sound but completely anonymous entity. Then, working with the accountant, we initiated a series of complex transfers. We moved every significant asset I personally owned, my inheritance, my premarital savings, the shares in my architecture firm, into the new company. We left the joint accounts with just enough money to look normal, enough to cover their usual rate of theft for a few more weeks so they wouldn't get suspicious. It was a stunning, high-stakes maneuver, and by the time we were finished, I was financially firewalled. My life's work, my future, was secure. As the first gray light of dawn began to break over Lake Michigan, Sarah finally closed her laptop. The accountant had already left, a silent partner in my liberation. It was just the 2 of us again. In the quiet of her office, the fortress around my assets was built. The first strike was Sarah looked at me, her eyes tired but fierce, and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. She told me that getting my money back was just the beginning. The real goal, she said, was to take everything from them. Their careers, their reputation, their freedom. She told me we were going to burn their whole world to the ground and salt the earth behind us. The war had begun. With my assets secured, a strange sense of calm settled over me. The frantic, paranoid energy that had fueled me for weeks was replaced by the cool, patient focus of a predator. I was still playing the part of the loving wife, but the performance no longer felt like a suffocating ordeal. It felt like a strategic advantage. Every morning I spent making him coffee. Every evening I spent listening to his fabricated stories about work. I was gathering intelligence. They thought they were the ones in control, moving their plan forward day by day. They had no idea they were already checkmated. The game was over, they just hadn't realized it yet. Sarah and I were in constant contact, running our operation with military precision. The private investigator continued to build our case, compiling a mountain of evidence that was now so high, it was irrefutable. We had everything: financial records detailing the fraudulent transfers, timelines of his secret visits to the Naperville house, and a gallery of photos that would make a jury's skin crawl. I added to the arsenal myself. I started carrying my phone with me everywhere, using its recording function to capture his lies. I'd ask innocent questions about our finances, about his plans for the future, and I would listen as he spun intricate webs of deceit, his voice smooth and convincing. Each recording was another nail for his coffin. We had the ammunition. What we needed now was the perfect moment to deploy it. Sarah made it clear that a quiet legal victory was not enough. We could have filed for divorce, handed the evidence to the district attorney, and let the justice system do its work. That felt too sterile, too private. They had built their entire scheme around a public lie. The lie of our perfect marriage, of their perfect family. The humiliation they had quiet, slow financial ruin had to be answered with a public and spectacular detonation of their work. We needed to destroy the one thing Margaret valued more than money, her reputation. We needed a stage. For weeks, we waited. We considered different scenarios, but nothing felt quite right. We needed a moment where the impact would be maximal, where their downfall would be witnessed by the very people whose opinions they cared about most. And then, one Tuesday evening in late autumn, they handed it to us on a silver platter. Ethan came home in a state of sheer euphoria. He burst through the door, his face flushed with a triumphant, almost manic energy. He dropped his briefcase, grabbed me by the waist, and lifted me off the ground. He announced that he had gotten the call. He had been made senior partner at his investment firm. I feigned shock, then joy, allowing him to spin me around the living room. He was giddy, telling me this was the culmination of everything he had worked for. He said without a trace of irony that my support had been the foundation of his success. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach, but I kept the brilliant, proud smile fixed on my face. Margaret, of course, arrived within the hour, a bottle of vintage champagne in her hand, having already heard the news. As they celebrated, toasting to his bright future, he delivered the final, perfect piece of our plan. To formalize the promotion, the firm was hosting its annual gala in 3 weeks. It was their biggest, most extravagant event of the year, held in the grand ballroom of a historic Chicago hotel. The entire leadership team would be there. Their most important clients, the titans of the city's financial industry, would be in attendance. The press was always there to cover the event for the society pages. And the highlight of the evening, he explained, would be the introduction of the new partners, each of whom would be invited on stage to say a few words. As he spoke, his eyes shining with ambition, a moment of absolute crystal. It was as if the universe, after throwing me into the darkest pit imaginable, had just thrown down a ladder. This was it. This was the stage, a room filled with everyone whose business he depended on. A night dedicated to celebrating his supposed integrity and success. It was the highest point he would ever reach in his life, and I was going to be the one to push him off the ledge. That night, I called Sarah. My voice was calm, but electus. I laid out the scenario. She was silent for a long moment on the other end of. Then she let out a low, appreciative whistle. The plan began to form, not as a legal strategy, but as a piece of theater. We weren't just lawyers or victims anymore. We were producers. Sarah had the PI create a high-resolution, large-format digital copy of the kiss photo. And to write my speech, not the one Ethan would expect, but the one that would end his life. As he even started to think about the dress I would wear. Something stunning. Something that would make everyone look at me. Something that would be remembered. Ethan thought he was planning his coronation. He had no idea he was actually planning his own public execution. The invitations arrived a week later, thick cream-colored cardstock with his name embossed in gold. Placed one on my desk, looking at it every day. It wasn't an invitation to a party. It was a ticket to the final act. and I was ready to give the performance of a lifetime. The day of the gala arrived with a quiet, electric hum. The air in our apartment it felt like the charged stillness before a violent thunderstorm. Outside, Chicago bustled on, oblivious. But inside, I was moving through the final hours of my old life. My every sense heightened. There was a faint tremor in my hands that I had to consciously still by clenching them into fists. In the pit of my stomach, a knot of ice had formed, cold and this wasn't fear. It was resolve. I was a demolition expert, standing in the lobby of a condemned building, my hand on the detonator. My preparation for the evening was a ritual. I laid out the dress I had chosen on my bed. It was a deep, emerald green silk that felt like liquid in my hands. It was a warrior's color, the color of envy and money. It was a dress that would command the attention of everyone in the room. As I did my makeup, I wasn't trying to look beautiful. I was constructing a mask of serene confidence. Each stroke of the eyeliner, each layer of mascara was a piece of armor. The woman staring back at me from the mirror with her calm, steady eyes was not the victim they had created. She was the weapon I had forged. Ethan was a mess of nervous excitement. He spent the afternoon pacing the apartment, rehearsing his acceptance speech in front of a mirror, constantly retying his bow tie. He was completely lost in the fantasy of his own success, a child on Christmas morning, blind to everything but the presents waiting for him under the tree. Margaret was there, of course. She had arrived midday to supervise, gliding through the apartment like a queen overseeing the preparations for her son's coronation. She radiated a smug, triumphant satisfaction that was almost suffocating. They were so close to their finish line, so drunk on their impending victory. They had become sloppy. The crack, the sign of their weakness, appeared an hour before we were due to leave. It was a small, quiet moment that I almost missed. The three of us were in the living room. Ethan, feeling expansive and powerful, was talking about the bonus he was expecting to get as a new partner. He casually mentioned wanting to buy a new sports car, a flashy, expensive model. He was talking to me, but I saw him shoot a look at Margaret, a look that was almost defiant. Margaret's smile tightened by a millimeter. She picked an invisible piece of lint off her coat gown and, without looking at him, told him that a sports car was an unnecessary extravagance. She said they should be focusing on making more sound investments. Her tone was soft, but it was laced with steel. It was an order. Watched Ethan's face fall. The triumphant partner replaced for a second by a sullen, resentful boy being scolded by his mother. He mumbled something about it just being an idea, and a tense, ugly silence fell between. I pretended not to notice, busying myself with an earring. But inside, I was taking careful notes. It was exactly what I had suspected. Their alliance, forged in shared desperation, was starting to fray under the pressures of their perceived success. Ethan, the puppet, was beginning to dream of cutting his strings. Margaret, the puppet master, had no intention of ever letting him go. They weren't a team. They were two parasites fighting over the same host. And that knowledge gave me a final, powerful surge of confidence. I wasn't just destroying a conspiracy. I was simply accelerating an inevitable implosion. The ride to the hotel was a study in silent tension. Ethan stared out the window, his good mood gone, replaced by a sulky petulance. Margaret sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed forward, radiating disapproval. I sat between them, a pool of perfect calm in a sea of their dysfunction. The city lights blurred past the window, painting fleeting streaks of color in the darkness. It felt like we were in a bubble, suspended in time, on our way to an execution. When we pulled up to the hotel, the bubble burst. A wall of flashing cameras erupted as the valet opened our door. Ethan's mask snapped back into place instantly. The sullen boy was gone, replaced again by the charming, successful financier. He stepped out of the car, beamed at the cameras, and then turned, extending a hand to me. I took it, allowing him to pull me into the glittering artificial light. I smiled, a brilliant, empty smile for the photographers. I was playing my part to the very end. He squeezed my hand, his palm sweating slightly, and led me through the grand hotel lobby towards the double doors of the ballroom. I could hear the murmur of the crowd, the swell of the orchestra from within. This was it. He thought I was his greatest asset, the beautiful, supportive wife who completed the picture of his perfect life. He thought he was leading me to his triumph. He had no idea he was walking me to the gallows. The curtain was about to rise. The The grand ballroom was even more opulent than I had imagined. Crystal chandeliers the size of small cars hung from the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm, golden light over a sea of Chicago's elite. The air buzzed with the murmur of 1,000 conversations, the clinking of champagne glasses, and the lush sound of a string orchestra. Ethan was in his natural habitat, gliding through the crowd like a shark, a confident smile plastered on his face. He pulled me along by the hand, a beautiful silent prop for his grand performance. I smiled, I nodded, I played my part, but my eyes were scanning the room, marking the positions of the key players. I saw Mr. Harrison, the firm's silver-haired CEO, holding court near the stage. I saw a well-known financial columnist for the Tribune, a woman whose pen could make or break careers. And I saw Margaret, seated at the table of honor right at the foot of the stage, looking every bit the Queen Mother, regal and smug. We sat through the dinner, a blur of exquisite food that I couldn't taste. The tension in my body had coiled into a tight, dense spring, ready to be released. I watched Ethan and Margaret, who were seated across from each other. They exchanged small, triumphant smiles, believing they were minutes away from securing their future. They had no idea they were on the edge of an abyss. Finally, the moment came. Mr. Harrison walked to the podium, the room falling into a respectful hush. He gave a long, eloquent speech about the values of the firm: integrity, trust, and excellence. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He spoke about the bright future ahead, led by a new generation of partners. And then, with a grand, sweeping gesture, he announced Ethan's name. The applause was thunderous. The entire room was on its feet. Ethan rose, his face a mask of humble gratitude. He kissed me quickly, a dry, papery kiss, and whispered a promise that our lives were about to change forever. He was right about that. He walked to the stage, shaking hands, basking in the spotlight. He reached the podium, looked out at the adoring crowd, and his eyes found Margaret. They shared a look of unadulterated victory. It was the last happy moment of his life. This was my cue. As Ethan opened his mouth to begin his speech, I stood up. I started walking towards the stage, my emerald dress flowing behind me. My movements were calm, unhurried. A confused murmur rippled through the room. Heads turned. The applause faltered. I saw Ethan's expression shift from triumph, reached the steps of the stage. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I gave him the most brilliant, loving smile I could muster. As I had rehearsed in my head 1,000 times, I reached him and spoke soft, telling him I was just too proud to stay in my seat. I asked if I could say a few words first. He was trapped. Fuse would be ungracious, strange, bloated with arrogance. He saw it as nothing more than a wife's public adoration. He nodded, handed me the heavy microphone, and stepped back, gesturing for me to take the spotlight. The room was utterly silent. Every eye was on me. I took a deep breath, the metallic taste of adrenaline on my tongue. I started warmly, my voice smooth, amplified throughout the cavernous hall. I told them all how incredibly proud I was to be celebrating the man I married. I talked about his drive, his ambition. I turned my head slightly and looked directly at Margaret, who was beaming at me from her seat. I told the room how grateful I was to her for raising such a devoted son, a man who had taught me that family is the most important thing in the world. And then I let a small, sharp pause. My voice dropped, becoming clearer. I continued, telling them he valued family so much, in fact, that he and his own mother had built an entire secret life together, a cozy little nest for two. As the words left my mouth, the giant screen behind me, which had been displaying the firm's logo, flickered. On a signal that my friend Sarah had arranged with a disgruntled AV technician, the logo vanished. In its place, an image bloomed 20 feet high, the crystal-clear photograph of Ethan and Margaret on the porch of the Naperville house, locked in a passionate, romantic kiss. The sound that erupted from the crowd was not a shout or a scream. It was a single, massive collective gasp, a sharp, ragged intake of breath from 300 people at once. It was the sound of a city's elite being confronted with a czar, so profoundly taboo it defied comprehension. I watched his charming smile dissolved. His skin went from tan to gray to a ghostly, bloodless white. His eyes were wide with a horror so absolute it was paralyzed. He looked from the screen to me, to the hundreds of shocked faces staring back at him. I saw Margaret, her face a frozen mask of disbelief, her wine glass slipping from her fingers to shatter on the floor. I wasn't finished. Into the deafening silence, my voice cut like a scalpel. I told them everything. I explained that the man on the stage was not a financial wizard, but a desperate gambling addict on the verge of bankruptcy. I explained that his mother was not a wealthy widow, but a socialite who had squandered her fortune. I told them our entire marriage was a meticulously planned fraud, a business arrangement designed to give them access to my money. I explained that they had been stealing from me for months to fund the very lifestyle, the very house they saw on the screen behind them. I let the weight of that sink in. Then, I walked across the stage to the stunned, speechless Mr. Harrison. I held up a thick manila envelope. I told him, my voice still amplified for all to hear, that this envelope contained the proof of everything I had just said. The bank statements, the wire transfers, the private investigator's complete report, and several audio recordings of my husband confessing to his crimes. I told him I was sure the firm's ethics committee, not to mention the IRS, would find it all very interesting. I turned back to the microphone one last time. I looked at the broken, hollowed-out shell of the man who was now trembling, unable to even look at. My final words were not shouted. They were delivered with a calm, quiet finality that was more brutal than any scream. I told him that, by the way, I wanted a divorce. I paused, letting my gaze drift from his horrified face to his mother's. And then I placed the microphone gently back on its stand. I turned, and without looking back, I walked off the stage, my head held high. The last thing I saw before I reached the exit was the tableau of utter devastation. The silent, gaping crowd, the frozen, shattered figures on the stage, the grotesque photographs still glowing like a monument to their depravity, and the first bright, predatory flash of a journalist's cell phone camera capturing the beginning of their end. I didn't look back. I walked out of that ballroom, through the stunned hotel lobby, and out into the cold Chicago night. The sound of the chaos I had unleashed, a rising wave of shouting and commotion, was cut off as the heavy glass doors swung shut behind me. The cool air on my face felt like a clean breath I had taken in over a year. Sarah was waiting for me at the curb, just as she'd promised, the engine of her car already running. I got in, and we drove away, leaving the wreckage of my old life burning, and I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I just felt quiet. The war was over. I was exhausted. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic, a media firestorm that exceeded even Sarah's most optimistic predictions. The story was simply too scandalous, too bizarre to ignore. By the next morning, it was everywhere. Ethan was fired, of course. His firm, in a desperate act of damage control, issued a public statement before noon, terminating his position and condemning his actions in the strongest possible terms. They handed over the envelope I had given the CEO, along with all of Ethan's internal files, to the district attorney's office. The criminal charges came swiftly: conspiracy, wire fraud, grand larceny. The career he had murdered his soul for was gone in less than 12 hours. Margaret's punishment was, in its own way, even more her world was built on reputation and social standing, and I had detonated a bomb in the middle of it. The society columns that once chronicled her now printed the most salacious details of the scandal. Her photo, the one from the porch, was plastered everywhere. Old friends suddenly stopped answering her calls. Charities she sat on the boards of politely asked for her resignation. She became a pariah, a ghost in the world that had once been her kingdom. They lost the house, too. The beautiful Naperville nest they had built with my money was seized as a criminal asset. The divorce was not a battle. It was a rout. They had nothing left to fight with. Sarah was magnificent, a legal force of nature. She dismantled them piece by piece, ensuring I got back every single cent they had stolen and then some. I never saw either of them in person again. I faced them only through legal documents, their signatures on pages of surrender. Winning the war was one thing. Learning to live in the peace that followed was another. For a long time, the silence was deafening. My first act of healing was to sell the apartment. It wasn't a home anymore. It was a museum haunted by the ghosts of 1,000 lies. I walked through its empty rooms one last time, feeling no nostalgia, no sadness. I closed the door and didn't look back. I poured all of my energy, all of my pain and rage and sorrow into my work. I sold my share in my old firm and used the money to start my own. A small studio at first, then something bigger. I took on challenging projects, designing homes and spaces for other people to build their lives in. There was a profound satisfaction in creating things that were beautiful, functional, and, above all, honest. Structures with nothing to hide. I found my purpose not in tearing something down, but in building something new. Something that was entirely mine. The journey was long. There were days when the anger would come roaring back, and days when a deep, hollow sadness would settle over me. Through it all, I came to a final, quiet the last and most important twist in the person I was angriest at, the person I had to learn to forgive, wasn't Ethan or Margaret, myself. I was furious with myself for not seeing, for trusting for believing in a fairy tale so completely that I ignored the monster hiding in plain sight. But I understood. My trust wasn't a weakness. My capacity to love wasn't a character flaw. Those were the best parts of me. They weren't the things that broke me. They were the things their darkness had tried and failed to extinguish. The crime was theirs. The shame was theirs. And the day I find myself for being a victim, the day I became a survivor. Today, my life isn't the gloss picture I once thought I wanted. It's better. It's real. It has texture and scars and stories. My definition of family is not about vows or bloodlines. It's about the fierce, unwavering loyalty of a friend like Sarah, who stood by my side in the trenches. It's about the life I have built with my own two hands, on my own terms. I learned in the most brutal way possible that fairy tales aren't real, but I also learned that the strength a woman finds in the ruins of her life is more powerful than any fantasy. You can't control the betrayals of others, but you are the sole architect of your own reconstruction. My story began in a hotel room in Chicago, but I know stories like this, stories of deception and survival, of rising from the ashes, happen in every city, in every town. It's a strange and powerful comfort, knowing we're not alone. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight. What city? What part of the world? Just to feel that connection, to know we're all out there, building our new lives, one brick at a time.